Dear students, next topic overhead absorption rate. The rate calculated for the purpose of absorption of overhead among the various cost units is known as overhead absorption rate. This rate is calculated by dividing the amount of overhead to be absorbed by the number of units in the base. The overhead rate may be blanket rate. The single overhead absorption rate set up for the entire factory is known as blanket rate. This rate is calculated by adding up the overhead of all the production departments and dividing the total by number of unit of any of the bases. Blanket rate is equal to total factory overheads divided by total number of unit of base for the factory. Then multiple rates. A separate overhead absorption rate set up for each of the production department are known as multiple rate. ഓരോ പ്രൊഡക്ഷൻ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റിനും സെപ്പറേറ്റ് റേറ്റ് ഫിക്സ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. A separate overhead absorption rate for each production department can be calculated by dividing the total overhead of each production department by number of unit of any of the bases selected for each production department. ഓരോ പ്രൊഡക്ഷൻ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റിനും സെലക്ട് ചെയ്യപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കുന്ന ഓവർഹെഡ് ഡിസ്ട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ റേറ്റ് അബ്സോർപ്ഷൻ റേറ്റ് ഉപയോഗിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഡിവൈഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. So the next one, actual rate. The actual overhead absorption rate is the rate computed on the basis of actual overhead. It is ascertained by dividing the actual overhead of a particular period by any of the actual basis of that period. An actual overhead rate is equal to actual factory overhead divided by actual basis. Then predetermined rate. Predetermined overhead absorption rate is the rate computed on the basis of estimated or budgeted overhead. It is ascertained by dividing the estimated or budgeted overhead for a particular period by any of the budgeted or estimated basis for that period. Predetermined overhead rate is equal to budgeted overhead divided by budgeted basis. Then standard overhead. A standard rate is the overhead absorption rate used in the place of predetermined rate where the standard costing is in use. It is computed by dividing the standard overhead for a period by standard base. Then standard rate is equal to standard overhead divided by standard basis. Then under absorption and over absorption of factory overhead. A factory overhead may be absorbed either at an actual overhead absorption rate or a predetermined overhead absorption rate. If the factory overhead are absorbed at an actual rate, the factory overhead absorbed during the period will be equal to the actual overhead incurred during that period. In such a there is neither under absorption nor over absorption of overhead, but when the factory overhead is absorbed at a predetermined rate, as is commonly done, there may be a difference between the factory overhead absorbed and the actual factory overhead incurred during that period. The difference between the factory overhead absorbed and the actual overhead incurred is called the under absorption of factory overhead or over absorption of factory overhead. If the factory overhead absorbed during the period are less than the actual factory overhead incurred, the difference is called under absorption of factory overhead. On the other hand, if the factory overhead absorbed during the period are more than the actual factory overhead incurred, the difference is called over absorption of factory overhead. The cause of under absorption or over absorption of factory overhead. Under absorption or over absorption of factory overhead may arise due to any of the following causes. Then errors in estimating the factory overhead expenses, errors in estimating the quantum of production, unforeseen changes in volume of production, under utilization of availability of capacity, seasonal fluctuation in the amount of overhead, use of unsuitable method of absorption of overhead, then accounting of under absorption and over absorption of factory overhead, disposal of overhead, then use of supplementary rate. If the amount of under or absorption is considerable, the cost of job or product is adjusted by means of supplementary levy of the overhead. Supplementary rate is calculated by dividing the amount of under or absorption of actual basis. Under absorption rate is set right by positive rate, while or absorption is adjusted by a negative rate. Then write off to costing profit or loss account. If the amount of under absorption or over absorption of overhead is small, it may be write off to costing profit and loss account. Carry over to the next year's overhead account. Under this method, under absorption or over absorption of overhead is each period is carried forward to overhead reserve account or overhead suspense account for the determination of overhead absorption rate of the next period. This is used where the normal business cycle is more than 1 year and overhead are determined on a long-term basis. Then method of absorption of administration overhead. The method of absorption of administration overhead. The administrative overhead refers to the indirect expenditure engaged in formulating policy, directing the organization and controlling of operating of the undertaking, which is not related directly to production, selling and distribution. In other words, they are the indirect expenditure connected with the administration of enterprise. Then office salary, office rent, postage, printing and stationery, director's fee, audit fee, bank charges, depreciation on office building and furniture, etc. Percentage on work cost. Under this method, administration overhead is as a percentage on work cost, or is equal to administration overhead divided by work cost into 100. Then percentage on sales. Under this method, administration overhead is required as a percentage on sales. Then overhead rate is equal to administration overhead divided by sales into 100. Then method of absorption of selling and distribution overhead. Selling and distribution are the indirect costs which are incurred for promoting sales and customer service. Distribution of overhead are indirect costs which relate to warehousing, packing of goods for dispatch and making them availability for delivery. Advertising, selling expense, go down expense, traveling expense, commission, discount are the example of selling and distribution overhead. Rate per unit sold. Under this method, selling and distribution overhead rate is computed by dividing selling and distribution overhead by a number of units sold. Overhead rate is equal to selling and distribution overhead divided by number of units sold into 100. Method of absorption, selling and distribution overhead, then percentage on sales. Under this method, selling and distribution overhead is recovered as a percentage on sales. Overhead rate is equal to selling and distribution overhead divided by sales into 100. Percentage on work cost. Under this method, selling and distribution overhead is recorded as a percentage on work cost. Overhead rate is equal to selling and distribution overhead divided by work cost into 100. Okay, thank you.